Welcome to PLUSone, the series where I look at all of the free games on PlayStation Plus and tell you if they're worth the download. After all, the games may be free, but your time is valuable. For February 2020, we have 3 PlayStation Plus titles, and like last month, one of those is a 3-game collection, so buckle up because we're in for a treat. These titles are BioShock The Collection, The Sims 4, and for PSVR owners, the tactical shooter Firewall 0 Hour, which I've gotta say might be one of the strongest VR games that I've played yet, and it's certainly the best one that we've gotten for free. Before we get into that one though, let's tackle the Big Daddy. In case you somehow missed the entire previous console generation, BioShock was one of its defining releases, one of the earliest and best examples of games being treated as a proper art form. And it's not just the one BioShock game that we're getting here, we're getting the warmly received BioShock 2 as well as 2013's BioShock Infinite, which, like the first game, received critical acclaim. Given how beloved this series is 7 years after its last title, and with rumors of a BioShock 4 on the way, it's not hard to see why these games are popping up for free. I'll say up front that there's almost no reason not to give this collection a download, especially for people that are new to the series or those that have maybe only played one of the games once or twice. For all of the age that the series shows mechanically, it's held up by its fantastic storytelling and themes. Naturally, these games have never looked better than they do here, with the collection bringing each of the games to full 1080p 60 frame per second glory. Although each of them sadly gave me some occasional stuttering and graphical bugs, and BioShock 1 especially had a ton of slowdown when fighting big daddies. Each of these issues definitely suck, but they don't take away from the games any more than the clunky gameplay does, and that clunkiness is noticeable, but thankfully not enough to hurt the games that much all these years later. With 3 full AAA games, each packed full of bonus content like developer commentary, DLC campaigns, challenge rooms, and more, I know that it's probably a bit intimidating if you're new to the franchise. And with that in mind, I'm gonna briefly break each game down to help you decide which BioShock games you should tackle first, and which ones you can probably put off till later. Let's start by diving into the first game, and diving into the underwater city of Rapture. After your plane crashes suddenly in the middle of the ocean, the protagonist Jack is lucky not only to survive, but to land right near a lighthouse with a transport dock into Rapture. Touted as an enlightened 1960s utopia by the outside world, Rapture is a haven where the wealthiest of society could live outside of the bounds of national governments and pesky things like laws and ethics. Jack finds out almost immediately that this utopia has quickly morphed into a dystopia, as Rapture fell victim to class warfare, chaos, and even a drug epidemic. Jack is thrust into a civil war between the uprising underclass and the city's creator, Andrew Ryan, who kindly asks for Jack's help. Players get to explore Rapture in full, and the city is beautifully crafted to feel like a cohesive, interconnected place. You'll often find yourself backtracking throughout the story through familiar areas, either looting for money, ammo, items, and health, or finding audio logs from the city's inhabitants and learning about the lives affected and ruined by Rapture. And of course, all the while you're shooting and killing tons of people, most of whom are hooked on Rapture's drug of choice, Adam, which can grant people superhuman abilities. Within about half an hour, Jack will have obtained some of these plasmid powers himself, such as telekinesis or the ability to shoot electricity from his hands. And you'll quickly get the hang of jumping between your guns and your plasmids, using the environment to your advantage by electrifying puddles of water or burning oil on the ground and taking out enemies, occasionally doing some simple little hacking minigames, and, of course, fighting the occasional Big Daddy. These behemoths are the closest thing that BioShock has to a proper boss, and each encounter is thrilling. Their only priority is to protect their little sister, a young girl whose body contains a ton of Adam, which makes them an appealing target for those who want more drugs or power. Sometimes you'll be forced into combat with them, while other times they'll walk right by you so long as you don't try to touch their little sister. That choice is yours to make, as is the choice of whether you'll save these girls from their Adam infections or harvest that Adam and kill them in the process. Given the fact that BioShock is almost 13 years old now, it's naturally aged the worst of the bunch. Gunplay just feels a little bit too clunky. Those mini-games are harmless but feel very much like something that would be cut out of any more modern games for being time wasters. And the heads-up display has a strange vibe to it that I can't quite put my finger on. For example, your static aiming reticle and the obnoxiously sized, curved floating enemy health bars feel so out of place nowadays. But they're also meant to match the rest of the game's almost abrasive, uncomfortable user interface design. I don't like anything about this game's HUD anymore, but that's also kind of why I love it. Even something that you're used to ignoring in other games has a way of keeping you constantly feeling distressed in BioShock. In some ways, those weaker controls even fit this too, ensuring that the game's age somehow only improves its theming. Anyway, I digress. BioShock is a one-of-a-kind video game, and regardless of if you haven't played it in years, or perhaps even at all, you should play through it yourself. It's considered one of the best games ever made for many, many reasons. There's just so much that I would love to talk about that I simply can't get into in a few minutes worth of overview. Both subsequent games are enhanced by playing this game first, so I really recommend that you start here. But if you just can't come to grips with those controls, you could jump ahead to BioShock Infinite. Infinite's opening is close to a one-to-one parallel of the first games, although this time it takes you back to the year 1912 and puts you into a rowboat as Booker DeWitt, a private investigator hired to find a mysterious girl. There's a lighthouse, a transport, all the same beats as the first game, but then, instead of sinking to the seafloor, Infinite takes you to the skies, and to the floating city of Columbia. When contrasted with the dark, decrepit, leaky Rapture, Columbia shines as this clean, serene example of turn-of-the-century American exceptionalism. You know, until like 10 minutes later when Booker sees just how racist this place is. Where Rapture was open and clear about what kind of city it was, Columbia's dirt is hidden just beneath the surface, just around the next corner, waiting to be blown open by the player. In Booker's quest to find the girl, he quickly runs afoul of Zachary Comstock, the religious zealot that rules over Columbia, and it just so happens that Booker is branded with the initials AD, the sign of a false prophet that Comstock has warned the city about for years. So, of course, Booker's now gotta kill a bunch of hyper-religious crazies who think he's working for Satan. This is where I get to say that Infinite feels so much better as a game compared to BioShock 1. It still aged a ton in the last 7 years, and even back in 2013, the gameplay wasn't really all that good, but it's passable enough and satisfying enough to keep you driving forward. It helps in this case that Infinite is a much more linear, by-the-numbers shooter compared to the first game's more open nature and all the tactical options that the player had. And that works to Infinite's benefit, I would say. Both games have their own flavors, but I've always had a softer spot for Infinite. I mean, come on, one of Booker's vigor abilities, this game's version of plasmids, lets you shoot crows out of your hands to devour enemies. And you can leap through areas and skylines with a badass grappling hook. Come on, that's just fun. That grappling hook, along with pieces of equipable gear scattered throughout Columbia that'll add bonus effects to either your attacks or Booker himself, still give Infinite some element of tactical play like the first game had, but it too is just fashioned in a more linear manner. The game's linearity allows it to tell a much more personal story than the first game. Where Andrew Ryan was a much colder, more matter-of-fact personality, Comstock really wants you dead, and he'll convince his entire town of otherwise normal super racist subjects to try and take you down. And that girl I mentioned earlier, Elizabeth, is one of the stars of the entire franchise. Caged for her entire life, Booker's mission to free Elizabeth allows her to start truly living, and you get to experience her character growing as you progress through the story. By the end of the game, much like a Big Daddy, Booker, and by extension you, will do anything to protect this girl. Now, thankfully, she doesn't actually need protecting. She has no health bar, and in fact, she'll help you more than you'll help her, often finding items, health, and money to assist you in a pinch. Plus, she can kinda sorta tear the fabric between multiple realities, so, yeah, that's usually helpful. BioShock Infinite also comes with all of its old downloadable content, including the Burial at Sea epilogue chapters to the main story, which you obviously shouldn't play until you've beaten that story, and it also loads you up with a bunch of bonus gear and like 6 extra upgrades at the start. It's honestly a little bit excessive, but hey, it's appreciated, I suppose. I personally tend to prefer Infinite just a little bit over the first game overall, but it wouldn't have been possible without that first game. As such, both of them are equally important experiences for you to play if you haven't already. And that brings us to BioShock 2, which, yeah, it's alright. 2 was made by a different studio to more or less cash in on the franchise's popularity in the 6 years between BioShock 1 and Infinite, and while it's certainly a fine game, it's mostly more BioShock 1 and more Rapture. The number one addition, and pretty much the only noteworthy one, is that in this game, you're playing as one of those big daddies. Now, don't get too excited, you don't have a ton of health like a Big Daddy, but you do have that sick drill, except it needs fuel to run. Yay. If you can look past those nitpicks, BioShock 2 is a much stronger game mechanically than BioShock 1, and arguably more so than Infinite, and funnily enough, it gives the player probably the most choice of the 3 games. The drawback is that it's very by the numbers compared to those two. BioShock 2 takes a long time to really get going, and in most of the game, it doesn't do much to stand out. Perhaps its most defining feature that helped it push out of the shadow of its predecessor, the online multiplayer, was cut from the collection, so that kinda sucks too. There's nothing particularly wrong with BioShock 2, but it just doesn't live up to the incredibly high bar that the series strives to hit. It's the kind of game that I would recommend you play only if you loved the other 2 games, or if you really want to see more of Rapture and what happens in the years after BioShock 1. Regardless of which game you play first, they're each gonna take you between 10 and 12 hours to beat, and by the time you're done, you might just want to go back for a second playthrough to see what you missed. Before we move from one dystopian world to another and talk about The Sims, let's dig into Firewall for those of you that have PSVR. This is one of those VR games that's just absolutely perfect to give away for free, given the fact that it's a multiplayer shooter, so player counts are always an issue, and that it's a VR exclusive, which means that player counts are even more of an issue. The game conceptually is nothing special. It's often called a VR version of games like Counter-Strike or perhaps more so Rainbow Six Siege, a highly tactical 4v4 shooter where one team attempts to hack into a laptop while the other tries to defend said laptop. You've got 1 life per round, and if you die, you're out, so you've got to make every movement count. How you assault or defend your objective is entirely up to you and your teamwork. Do you want to breach the front door and throw a smoke grenade in? Do you want to come in from 4 different rooms at once? Or do you want to lure the enemies out one by one and pick the team apart? The choice is entirely yours. Well, yours and your team's, so make sure you actually, maybe communicate every now and then. In the game's base release, you can pick from one of 4 playable characters, each with different class abilities such as having quieter movement or extra defense against explosive damage. If you really fall in love with the game and want to try something else, there are also a handful of DLC characters that each cost about $4 extra. My biggest concern with Firewall is that the matchmaking isn't that well optimized. I don't understand why, but each game only has a single round. One side attacks, the other defends, and that's it, game over. Given that these games typically last around 5 minutes tops, it's absurd that there's no option to matchmake for a best of 3 or 5 round structure. Just as you're getting into a match, it's already over, and you don't really get to learn the opponent's strategies or adjust your own. The last thing that I want to do when I'm sitting in a VR headset is to play a match that's 3 minutes long and then sit in the lobby for another 1 to 5 minutes just to play one more round. I don't understand how so many PSVR games have this issue. It's pretty much a fundamental of matchmaking design that you spend as little time as possible to get the player back into the action. But at the very least, when you are playing, the gameplay is just stellar. The weapons feel good, there are a ton of awesome secondaries and perks, and there's something so satisfying about being able to move forward while peeking around every corner by just turning your head. It just never gets old. For a VR experience, this is as close to perfect as the PSVR can get. I personally had no motion sickness whatsoever in my time playing, and I had adjusted all of my settings so that I had smooth turning on and I turned off all the vignette effects while turning or running. Essentially, I tried to make myself nauseous playing this game, and I could not. The aiming is just fantastic once you play a round or 2 and start getting used to it, although keep in mind you're not going to be getting hit markers if your bullets make contact with the enemy. That kind of threw me off at first. And remarkably, I only ran into one big instance of controller desync that I couldn't immediately reset, and that was in my final round before I made this video. Sadly, there's no campaign mode, just a tutorial, a PvE mode against bots, and a single PvP game mode. How there's no options like deathmatch mode that'll let you learn the gameplay and the maps and level up a bit faster is again another head scratcher. In short, if you wanted to play a single player experience, Firewall certainly isn't for you. On the other hand, this is one of, if not the strongest PSVR multiplayer game in spite of that frustrating round structure. I just wish some basic quality of life improvements would have been implemented in the last year and a half instead of adding 8 paid DLC characters. Whew, this has already been the longest +1 yet, and we've still got one more game to go. Thankfully, I don't have a ton to say about The Sims 4 because everybody knows The Sims. It's one of those classic games that everybody's had to have experienced at least once in their lives, and it's another game that's quite like no other. The Sims 4 on consoles is the most faithful transition from the proper PC release that we've had yet, which is both a good and a very bad thing. I mean, look, the game even opens up by showing you the 8 $40 expansion packs that you don't have, the 8 other $20 DLC packs that you don't have, and the 16 smaller $10 DLC packs that you also don't have. And don't forget that like half of these things were either in the base game or DLC for the previous Sims games. Remember back when EA said,
"It's in the game"?
Don't worry, they forgot too. On console, The Sims 4 gives you every option that you'd have if you were playing this game on your computer. You even have a mouse cursor if you want it to pinpoint your tweaks. There are points of articulation on your roofs, your buildings, and even your Sims features, a robust customization suite, and menus upon menus upon menus upon menus upon menus. Oh god, make it stop! If you want to play this game on your PS4, make it a priority to plug in a mouse and keyboard because all of these precise options and the dozens of overlaid menus make it just about impossible to make what you want on a controller. I tried, I really did try, but maybe within 2 minutes after selecting build, then building materials, then floor materials, then color, then type, and then building my floor but waiting in between because the game slowed down, and then pressing circle 5 times to get back to just the build menu, I was already so done with the building suite that I just moved into a prefabricated house and focused on the Sims part of The Sims. Sadly, even this is kind of frustrating thanks to those difficult controls. I just want to get a decent view of my sim and what he's doing, and that involves either several inputs or for me to go into the horrifying glitchy first-person mode. And even then, I would take the bugs in the first-person mode. That would be fine if not for the fact that for some reason, no version of The Sims 4 allows you to have direct control of your sim. This would have been the perfect time to lean back into the unique style that the console versions of The Sims 2 had back in the day. It was awesome to be able to at least try and be your sim, and it made the controls a simple task to manage because you could just play it like any other game ever. And then there are the other issues, like how the game has to load if you decide you want to visit the next door neighbor's house. The Sims 3 got away with having a pretty open world without having these constant loading screens, so just like everything else with The Sims 4, this is just a step back. Even in spite of all of the awful issues the console release has, perhaps the worst part is that it's still got that addicting progression loop. Everything your sim does in some way progresses that character. Maybe it's fishing, or reading, or complaining about local youth to your neighbor while sitting in a robe on your porch eating a sandwich. The lives and the constant accomplishments of your sims are the best part of The Sims. For example, my sim wanted to be a chef, so he cooked a fish taco dinner for 6 in his 2-person household while his wife was asleep, and he sat there eating 6 plates of fish tacos alone at 2 a.m. You know what he was feeling emotionally during all of this? Fine. He said he was fine. I've never related so well with anything in my life, and no other game can do something like that. That such a unique, enthralling experience is wrapped up in such a frustrating package is a travesty. I'm sure some of you will be able to get past the dozens, if not hundreds of issues The Sims 4 has on console, and if you can make it through, you'll have your own experiences just like these, the kinds that make The Sims so special. If you think you can, go for it, but for the love of God, plug in a mouse if you do. Otherwise, this PS Plus edition is just a cash-in attempt. After all, let's be real, the only reason The Sims 4 is free on PS Plus is to try to get you hooked on The Sims just enough to buy one or more of the overpriced DLC packs, or even better to get you to subscribe to EA Access on PS4 for only $30 a year to get all of that overpriced DLC for free. And you know what? I've gotta say, it kind of worked on me. Now I want to go out and buy The Sims 2 on PS2 so I can play a fun Sims game on console once again. So that's February all wrapped up. 4 strong games and a Sims game that will make you want to play a good Sims game. Which games are you going to jump into first, and what games are you hoping to see on PS Plus next month? As always, let me know in the comments. I'll see you again in just a few days for another video. We're keeping this video train rolling, folks. So until next time, stay golden.